I stood at the window in my bedroom, adjusting the creases in the dark blue dress I'd bought especially for this day. Chloe always said that blue was a good color for me, made my eyes look brighter. She used to say that. Now she rarely paid attention to me at all, and if she did, it was more with irritation than with warmth. Outside the window, I could see the rooftops of our Williamsburg neighborhood, where I'd lived for 40 years, and where little Chloe used to run when she came to visit me on weekends. At 72, I don't yet feel like a decrepit old woman. My back is straight, my gait confident, my voice clear. Victoria Elizabeth Grayson is the name on my passport, though everyone calls me Vicky. Only Chloe called me Grandma Vicky as a child, and for the last few years just Grandma, and even then through force. Chloe's wedding. The words seemed strange, even though I'd been repeating them for weeks. My granddaughter is marrying a guy I've only seen 3 times. David Parker, 29 years old, works at a marketing agency, lives in a rented apartment downtown. That's all I know about him. Chloe doesn't feel the need to share the details of her personal life with her family, especially with me. When she first told me about him 6 months ago, I felt that something in her voice changed definitively. It used to be that when Chloe fell in love, she would call me in the middle of the night to share every detail of their relationship, describing what the boy looked like, what he said, what their weekend plans were. I listened for hours, rejoicing in her happiness, giving advice she never intended to follow through on. I loved being part of her world, feeling needed and important to her only granddaughter. Now Chloe is 28, and she communicates with me only out of necessity. The calls have become infrequent and businesslike. Grandma, how are you doing? I'm doing fine. Work is busy. No details, no personal experiences. She had grown up and turned into a stranger who technically remains my granddaughter, but emotionally lives in a completely different world where I am not allowed. I stepped away from the window and walked to the dresser, where there were pictures in wooden frames. Chloe in kindergarten with pigtails and a blue polka dot dress. Chloe at her high school graduation with a big smile and a diploma in hand. Chloe at my birthday party 3 years ago. In the last picture, her smile is already different. Strained, polite, like a person who is fulfilling a social obligation. At that time, I didn't realize that something had changed dramatically and irreversibly. The change began after Chloe entered college at 18. At first, she called regularly, complaining about the load, talking about new friends, asking for money for textbooks. But gradually, the conversations became shorter and the visits less frequent. Grandma, I have a session. Grandma, I have practice. Grandma, I need to prepare for the defense of my diploma. There were always reasons not to come, not to call me, not to spend weekends with me as before. When she got a job in an advertising agency right after graduation, the distance increased even more. Chloe started talking about her career, the importance of professional growth, how much time it takes to build a successful future. Her speech became filled with terms from the business world that sounded like a foreign language to me. She stopped being the girl who used to come over to my house to bake pies and listen to stories about our family and great-grandparents. It was especially painful to see how Chloe began to feel about her parents. My son Thomas and his wife Susan had always been good parents, patient and loving. But to the adult Chloe, they became a source of discomfort and embarrassment. She criticized their lifestyle, their job choices, their habits, their friends. Mom, you could dress more stylishly. Dad, your job at the car service isn't prestigious. Words that made my heart clench. Thomas told me this with pain in his voice during our weekly phone conversations. He didn't understand what had happened to his daughter, why she had become so cold and demanding. Susan just kept quiet when I broached the subject, but I could see in her red eyes how much she was suffering from the indifference of her only child. They continued to love Chloe no matter what. and that made the situation even more painful for all of us. I held up a picture of 5-year-old Chloe with ice cream smeared on her cheeks. The picture showed us standing together at an amusement park, her arms wrapped tightly around my waist, and me smiling as I looked down at her. She was so open then, so genuine, could come running to me with any problem, could cry on my shoulder, could laugh herself to tears at stupid jokes. Where did that child go? When exactly did my granddaughter turn into a stranger? The wedding invitation arrived in the mail a month ago. Not a personal delivery, not a warm conversation, but a formal card with gold embossing and ornate letters. Chloe Miller and David Parker invite you to share in the joy of their marriage on Saturday, November 4th at 5 o'clock in the afternoon at Riverview Restaurant. Even in those words, there was no warmth, only social correctness. I called her to congratulate her, but the conversation turned strained and awkward. Thank you, Grandma. Yes, we are very happy. The wedding will be at a restaurant. Everything will be very beautiful and elegant. No details about how they met, how he proposed, what their honeymoon plans were. Just the facts, stated dryly and without emotion. When I tried to ask about the dress, about the bouquet, about the ceremony, Chloe answered one-word answers as if she was doing her duty. Especially unpleasant was the moment when I offered to help with the organization of the celebration. No need, Grandma. We have everything under control. We have a professional planner. Just come and enjoy the festivities. The tone was polite but cold. She didn't want me involved in the preparations for the most important day of her life. I was just a guest who was invited as a courtesy. I slowly placed the picture back on the dresser and walked to the closet to pull out my shoes. Dark blue, with a small heel, comfortable for a long evening. As I put them on, I thought about how Chloe and I used to be able to talk about outfits for hours. She would ask for my opinion, try on different options, ask me about my experience. Grandma Vicky, what shoes would go better with this dress? Now she hadn't even told me what color her wedding dress would be. Glancing at the clock on the bedside table, I realized it was time to pack up and leave the house. The wedding starts at 5 o'clock in the afternoon, and I need to get to the restaurant, which is at the other end of Williamsburg, about a half-hour bus ride away. I grabbed a small black purse, checking to see if there was a gift envelope with money in it. Chloe asked for money instead of a gift. Grandma, we care more about practical things than souvenirs right now. Even that sounded like a business plan, not a request from a loved one. It took me a long time to choose a gift, despite her specific request. I wanted to give something meaningful, something that would remind her of our connection and family traditions. In the end, I settled on an antique brooch that belonged to my mother, and before that, to her mother. A small bouquet of forget-me-nots made of blue stones in a gold setting, finely crafted by early 20th century artisans. My mother wore it on her wedding day. Then I wore it on mine. Now I wanted to give it to Chloe, but I doubted whether she would appreciate the gesture and the symbolic value of a family heirloom. In recent months, I'd noticed more and more often that Chloe had begun to deliberately avoid family traditions and holidays. She didn't show up for her maternal grandfather's birthday, citing important work over the weekend. She skipped family Thanksgiving dinner, explaining that she had plans with David's friends, whom we'd never met. Every time, there was a good reason why she couldn't be with us at important times. It was as if our family had become a burden for her to get rid of. Thomas tried to justify it and find rational explanations. Mom, she's an adult. She has her own life. You need to give her space and not impose your society on her. But I could see in his face how much he was suffering from the alienation of his only daughter. Susan stopped cooking the special dishes that Chloe once loved because she knew she wouldn't come over and appreciate the effort. There was a sad silence in my son's house, as if the life and joy had gone out of it. I remembered the times when family holidays were noisy and fun. Chloe was the center of attention. She sang songs, danced to old music, told funny stories from school life. Everyone laughed at her jokes, admired her success in her studies, made plans for the future. Now these meetings became formal and tense. We all felt that an important part of our family had disappeared, although Chloe was still physically present in our lives sometimes. The last time she visited me was 3 months ago. She came for half an hour, had a cup of coffee, told me about a promotion at work, and left, citing a meeting with friends. Even in my house, where she had spent so many happy childhood days, she felt uncomfortable and eager to leave as soon as possible. I offered to stay for dinner to make her favorite lasagna, but she politely declined. As I left the bedroom, I glanced once more at the pictures on the dresser. Little Chloe was smiling at me from each picture, and there was real love and affection in those smiles. I walked slowly down the stairs, grabbed my coat from the hallway, and walked out onto the porch, locking the door with two locks. The day was cool, typical of November in Virginia, with gray skies and a light wind. As I walked to the bus stop, I thought about what this wedding would be like. Chloe had probably organized everything flawlessly, with attention to detail and good taste. But would there be room for genuine emotion? Will I see even for a moment the girl I once loved so much? Or will the whole evening be spent in an atmosphere of polite detachment, where I will be just one of many guests fulfilling a social role? The Riverview restaurant greeted me with the sparkle of crystal chandeliers and the scent of expensive flowers. I had never been in such an exquisite establishment. White tablecloths, silverware, waiters in impeccable suits who moved between tables with the silent grace of professionals. Chloe had obviously spent a lot of money on this celebration, though where she got such funds for the salary of a junior manager in an advertising agency remained a mystery. The administrator, in an elegant black dress, escorted me to the banquet hall, where about 50 people had already gathered. I recognized only a few faces: my son Thomas in a new dark gray suit that had obviously been bought especially for the occasion, his wife Susan in a blue dress and neat hair. They stood by the window, holding champagne glasses, and looked a little lost among strangers. The rest of the guests were completely unknown to me. Chloe's colleagues from the agency, young people in expensive suits, who were laughing loudly and discussing work projects. David's friends, the same group of successful young professionals who kept to themselves and talked about things that were incomprehensible to the rest of us. Two older women, whom I assumed were relatives of the groom, sat at a separate table and watched with obvious disapproval. I approached Thomas and Susan, and we embraced with that cautious warmth that comes when people haven't seen each other for a long time and don't know what to talk about. Susan looked tired despite her careful makeup, and Thomas was nervously rubbing his glass in his hands. "Mom, how did you get here? Is everything okay?" my son asked, and I could hear the same tension in his voice that had been present in all of our conversations about Chloe lately. "Fine, the bus ride was no problem. Where's our bride?" I replied, looking around. "Chloe's in a private room getting ready with her bridesmaids. Said she'd come out when all the guests were gathered," Susan explained quietly. "We've hardly spoken to her since we arrived. She's been very busy with organizational matters." I nodded, though something inside clenched at those words. Even on her wedding day, Chloe hadn't made time for her parents. The three of us stood among strangers, feeling unwelcome at our own daughter and granddaughter's party. A few minutes later, David entered the hall, accompanied by a tall, gray-haired man I recognized as his father. David looked excited but happy. He smiled and shook hands with the guests. When he saw us, he immediately headed in our direction. "Mrs. Grayson, how nice that you were able to come," he said, shaking my hand firmly. "Chloe was really worried about whether you'd get here without any problems." The words sounded sincere, and I felt some sympathy for him. At least he showed more consideration for my presence than his own granddaughter. David introduced us to his father, Robert Parker, the owner of a small construction company. Robert turned out to be a pleasant man, and we talked about the weather and how quickly time flies. I remember when David was your granddaughter's age, I thought he would never get married, Robert said with a smile. And now here we are, a wedding of our own. Chloe is a wonderful girl, very determined. Purposeful. Interesting choice of words. I wondered exactly what Robert meant, but didn't pursue the subject further. There was something in his tone that made me think that David's family wasn't all that happy with this union either. Suddenly, the music got louder, and all heads turned toward the main entrance of the hall. Chloe appeared, accompanied by three bridesmaids in matching purple dresses. My granddaughter looked stunning in a snow-white dress with a lace bodice and long skirt. Her hair was tucked into an elegant updo, her makeup flawless. She smiled broadly and confidently as she accepted congratulations and compliments. But in this smile, there was something naive, too bright, like an actress on the stage. Chloe moved through the hall with the grace of a model, stopping at each group of guests. But her gaze was cold and calculating. She obviously controlled every moment, every word, every gesture. When Chloe approached us, I expected a warm embrace, but received only a formal kiss on the cheek and a duty smile. "Grandma, I'm so glad you came. You look very pretty," she said in the voice one usually uses to thank someone for a gift they didn't really like. "Chloe, darling, you are just gorgeous. Congratulations from the bottom of my heart," I replied, trying to put all my love into the words. "Thank you. I hope you like the restaurant. We spent a long time choosing a place for the celebration," Chloe continued, already looking around for the next group of guests to greet. The conversation with her parents was also brief and formal. Chloe thanked them for coming, praised Susan's outfit, promised to talk later when she was free from organizational matters. No personal words, no emotional intimacy. Even on her own wedding day, she kept her distance from her family. I watched Chloe interacting with other guests and noticed a striking difference in her behavior. With coworkers, she was animated and witty, discussing mutual acquaintances and corporate news. With David's friends, she was charming and flirtatious, laughing at their jokes and making small talk. But when it came to the groom's family, her manner changed dramatically. This was especially noticeable in her interactions with David's mother, an elderly woman named Carol. Mrs. Parker clearly tried to establish contact with the future daughter-in-law, asked about work, about plans for the future, offered help in organizing. But Chloe answered dryly and one-wordedly, as if she were performing an unpleasant duty. "Carol, thank you for the offer, but we have everything under control," Chloe said when her mother-in-law offered to help set up the tables. "David and I prefer to handle such matters ourselves." The tone was polite but cold. Carol was visibly embarrassed and stepped aside, while Chloe immediately switched to talking to her co-workers, becoming lively and friendly again. I saw how painfully Robert Parker reacted to this episode. He loved his wife and could not look indifferently at the way she treats her future daughter-in-law. Half an hour later, the waiter invited everyone to the tables. The seating had been thought out to the last detail. The bride's family at one table, the groom's family at another, colleagues and friends in separate groups. It was practical, but it made it feel separate, as if we were attending a merger of two companies rather than a family reunion. I found myself between Thomas and an unfamiliar middle-aged woman who introduced herself as David's aunt. Susan sat across the table, next to the groom's cousin. Chloe and David took seats at the main table, decorated especially lushly with white roses and gold ribbons. During dinner, I continued to watch my granddaughter. She was impeccable in her role as hostess, making sure everyone had food and drink, signaling to the waiters when they needed to clear plates or bring the next course. But her behavior lacked the natural joy that usually radiates from a bride on her wedding day. Especially odd were her attempts to control every aspect of the celebration. When one of David's friends began to tell a funny story from their college years, Chloe tactfully but insistently turned the conversation to another topic. When Carol Parker tried to make an impromptu speech about how happy she was to have Chloe in their family, the bride quickly interrupted her with the words that official congratulations would be later. I understood that Chloe wanted everything to go according to plan, but her control was crossing reasonable boundaries. She didn't let the event develop naturally, didn't let people show spontaneous emotions. The wedding was turning into a flawlessly choreographed performance where everyone had to play a designated role. David didn't seem to notice this tension or chose to ignore it. He was genuinely happy, laughed a lot, and interacted with all the guests with equal warmth. When his younger brother started joking about his bachelor habits, David laughed heartily, but I noticed how Chloe tensed up, ready to interfere at any moment. By the end of the dinner, the atmosphere became even more strained. Chloe was obviously nervous, though she tried not to show it. She often corrected her hair, checked her phone, gave instructions to the organizers. David's family looked confused and a little overwhelmed by the bride's coldness, and our family just watched in silence. Susan said quietly to me, "Vicky, I think Chloe is very tense. Maybe she's just worried." I nodded, but I knew it wasn't just worry. My granddaughter was acting like she was doing a difficult job, not celebrating the happiest day of her life. And that scared me more than I was willing to admit even to myself. After the main courses, the waiters began to arrange the desserts, and the atmosphere in the hall became a little more relaxed. The guests drank champagne. The conversations became louder. Someone even laughed for real. But I kept watching Chloe and saw how she was getting more and more tense by the minute. The first incident occurred when David's uncle, an elderly man with a good-natured face, came to our table to introduce himself. Frank Parker appeared to be a simple man, had worked as a mechanic all his life, spoke with a slight Southern accent, and was clearly uncomfortable in this sophisticated setting. "You must be the bride's grandmother," he said to me with a smile. "Frank Parker, David's uncle. Nice to meet Chloe's family." We chatted about where he came from, his work, what David was like as a kid. Frank told funny stories, and I laughed heartily. Thomas and Susan joined in the conversation, and for the first time all evening I felt comfortable. But suddenly Chloe came up to us. Her face was strained, though she kept smiling. "Uncle Frank, how are you doing? I hope you're enjoying everything," she said in a tone that made it clear the conversation had to be curtailed. "Everything is fine, dear. I'm here to meet your grandmother, a wonderful woman," Frank replied, not taking the hint. "That's very nice, but I'm afraid I need to pick up my grandmother. We have a photo shoot planned with the bride's family," Chloe lied, taking me under her arm. I knew there was no photo shoot planned, but I didn't mind. Frank looked embarrassed, said goodbye, and stepped away. Chloe led me to the side and I felt her muscles tense. "Chloe, honey, Frank is a very nice man. He just wanted to meet you," I said quietly. "Grandma, I know you wanted to be polite, but that man can talk a lot of nonsense. He has no education and doesn't understand how to behave at such events," my granddaughter replied, not hiding her irritation. The words hit me like a slap. Chloe had always been a smart girl, but when did she become such a snob? When did she start dividing people into those worthy and unworthy of her attention? "Chloe, education doesn't make a person good or bad. Frank is part of David's family, and if you're marrying his nephew—" "Grandma, please don't lecture me on family values." My granddaughter interrupted me. "I know what I'm doing. Just trust me and don't get involved in things you don't understand." She turned and walked away, leaving me standing in the middle of the hall with an aching heart. I walked back to the table where Thomas and Susan were anxiously watching our conversation. "Mom, what happened?" my son asked. "It's nothing much. Chloe's just nervous," I lied, not wanting to upset them further. But Susan understood exactly what was going on. She put her hand on my shoulder and said quietly, "Vicky, don't take it personally. She didn't do it on purpose." The next conflict broke out a half hour later. David's mother, Carol, tried to organize a group photo with relatives. She asked the photographer to take some shots of both families together, which seemed like a natural desire for such an occasion. Chloe agreed at first, but when everyone started lining up for the photo, she had a sudden change of heart. "You know what? Let's do the photos of just the bride's family first, then the groom's family separately, and we'll save the group shots for later," she declared, although it was written all over her face that the later would never come. Carol was confused. "But, dear, wouldn't it be nice to have shared family photos? Years from now, it will be nice to remember this day." "Carol, I have a clear plan for the photo shoot. The photographer is on time and we can't disrupt the schedule," Chloe cut off. I saw how painfully the older woman reacted to these words. She obviously expected a warm relationship with her daughter-in-law, but received only coldness and rejection. Robert Parker looked gloomily at what was happening, but he remained silent. I felt ashamed of my granddaughter's behavior. I approached Carol and said quietly, "Don't be upset, please. Chloe is really very nervous. I'm sure she'll be happy to take general photos later." "Thank you, Victoria. You're very kind," Carol replied, but there were tears in her eyes. Chloe noticed our conversation and was clearly not pleased. She walked over to me with a strained smile. "Grandma, you don't need to apologize for me. I'm a grown woman and I can explain my own decisions. Chloe, I just wanted to—" "I know you wanted to, but it's my wedding and I'll decide how it should go. Please don't get in my business." Her voice was quiet, but there was such coldness in it that I felt uneasy. This wasn't the girl I'd raised and loved. This was a stranger in a familiar guise. The third incident happened during the dance. The DJ turned on slow music, and the newlyweds opened the dance portion of the program. Chloe danced flawlessly, as she always did everything lately. But even in this intimate moment, she continued to control what was going on, giving signs to the DJ when to change the song. When the next song played, David asked his mother to dance. It was a touching tradition, and Carol glowed with happiness. Robert invited me, and we went to the dance floor as well. For a few minutes, everything was fine. But then David's younger brother, Michael, a little tipsy and jolly, decided to give an impromptu toast. He took the microphone from the DJ and started talking about how happy he was for his brother and how happy he was to see him married. "David was always the most responsible of us brothers," Michael said with a smile, "and I knew that when he found his soulmate, he would love her with all his heart. Chloe, welcome to our crazy family." The guests laughed and clapped. It was a sincere, warm moment, but I could see Chloe tense up. She clearly hadn't planned any spontaneous speeches. Michael continued, "I remember when David first told me about Chloe. He said he'd met the woman of his dreams. And you know what? He wasn't exaggerating. Chloe is beautiful and smart and—" "Thank you, Michael." His fiancée interrupted him as she approached the microphone. "That's very nice of you." She took the microphone from his hands with such insistence that the guy was confused. "But let's get back to dancing. We still have a lot of music ahead of us." Michael stepped back in embarrassment, and the guests looked at each other perplexed. The moment was ruined. The warm atmosphere dissipated. David looked puzzled by his wife's behavior, but said nothing. I couldn't stay silent any longer. Walking up to Chloe as she handed the microphone to the DJ, I said quietly, "Honey, Michael just wanted to say something nice." Grandma, he was drunk. Drunk people can say anything. I couldn't let him ruin the celebration. But he said nice things about you and David. It doesn't matter. I'm responsible for making sure everything goes perfectly, and I won't let anyone disrupt my plan. There was such a hardness in her voice that I involuntarily took a step back. Chloe looked at me with irritation. And anyway, Grandma, you've been meddling in my affairs too much today. I told you to just come and enjoy the festivities. Chloe, I'm not meddling. I'm just trying to understand. There's no need to understand anything. Just act like a guest and stay out of things that don't concern you. She said the last words rather loudly, and several people turned around to look at us. I felt the blood rush to my cheeks with shame and pain. My granddaughter was publicly reprimanding me like a naughty child. Thomas approached us with a worried face. "What's going on?" "Nothing much, Daddy. Grandma's just a little tired," Chloe said, instantly changing her tone to sweet. "Maybe she'd better sit down." My son took me under his arm and led me to the table. I was grateful he didn't question me in front of everyone, but things were boiling inside of me. Who gave Chloe the right to talk to me like that? When did she start thinking she had the right to humiliate the people who loved her? Susan brought me a glass of water and sat down next to me. "Vicky, maybe we should leave early. You seem upset." I wanted to agree. I wanted to get up and leave this cold, fake holiday where my own granddaughter treated me like an annoying stranger. But something made me stay. Maybe the last hope that Chloe would come to her senses and remember who I was to her. The rest of the evening was spent in a gloomy atmosphere. Chloe didn't approach me anymore, but I could feel her wary gaze. She continued to play the role of the perfect bride to the other guests. But the groom's family looked increasingly depressed. Carol hardly spoke. Robert was gloomily silent. Even the jovial Michael had fallen silent after an unfortunate toast. David tried to maintain a festive mood, but it was obvious that he felt the tension and did not understand the reasons for it. Sometimes he looked at his wife puzzled, as if he saw her in a new light. I sat at the table, mechanically eating dessert and thinking about how everything had gone wrong. It should have been a happy day, bringing two families together. Instead, it turned out to be a cold spectacle where the main character methodically pushed away everyone who tried to show sincere involvement. The moment that changed everything came unexpectedly. I was sitting at the table, finishing my coffee and watching the waiters clear away the rest of the desserts. Most of the guests had already moved on to informal socializing. Some were dancing, some were standing in groups and talking while holding champagne glasses. The atmosphere became more relaxed, although the tension created by Chloe still hung in the air. David was talking to his colleagues at the window, occasionally glancing at his wife, who methodically went around the tables, checking if everything was in order. Chloe was in her element, controlling the situation, giving instructions to the staff, making sure that every detail corresponded to her plan. But I could see that under the mask of impeccable organization, there was a growing irritation. Carol Parker sat in the corner of the room with her two sisters, who had traveled from a neighboring state for the wedding. The older women were talking quietly among themselves, and it was obvious from their faces that they were discussing the bride's behavior. Occasionally, they looked sympathetically at Carol, who was clearly suffering from the coldness of her future daughter-in-law. Robert Parker stood beside his brother Frank, and both looked gloomy. They talked in low voices, occasionally throwing glances in Chloe's direction. It was clear that the groom's family felt unwelcome at the celebration that was to unite them with the bride's family. Thomas and Susan were trying to keep up a conversation with the few relatives who had come from our side of the family. My cousin Patricia and her husband had flown in from California especially for the wedding, and I could see that they too were perplexed by Chloe's behavior. Patricia remembered my granddaughter as a little girl and clearly did not recognize in the cold bride that affectionate and open little girl. I got up from the table, feeling the need to stretch my legs and get away from heavy thoughts. I went to the window and looked out at the evening Williamsburg, illuminated by the street lamps. The river flowed calmly, reflecting the lights of the city, and it was soothing to my frayed nerves. It was at that moment that Michael, David's younger brother, came up to me. The guy looked upset after Chloe had interrupted his toast so rudely. He was holding a wine glass and clearly wanted to talk to someone. "Mrs. Grayson, can I talk to you for a moment?" he asked quietly. "Of course, Michael. Call me Victoria." "Victoria, I wanted to apologize for what happened earlier. Maybe I really shouldn't have taken the microphone without permission." I looked at this young man, sincere, a little shy, who just wanted to express his joy for his big brother. In his eyes was the pain of inexplicable rejection. "Michael, you didn't do anything wrong. Your words were very warm and sincere. Any normal person would be happy to hear such wishes. But Chloe apparently thinks differently. To be honest, I don't really understand her. David is happy, but she's kind of weird, very controlling. I felt the need to protect my granddaughter, despite my own doubts. Chloe just wants everything to go perfectly. It's an important day in her life. Yes, I understand, but isn't a wedding supposed to be about love and joy, not about being in control? Michael's words hit the spot. That's exactly what I'd been feeling all evening, but couldn't articulate. Chloe had turned her wedding into a business event where there was no room for spontaneous emotions and sincere warmth. "Maybe she's just nervous," I said, though I didn't believe that explanation myself anymore. We talked for a few more minutes, and I felt a genuine sympathy for Michael. He told me how David had changed since he'd met Chloe. More withdrawn, less in touch with his family, as if he were always walking on a knife edge. David used to be such an open, fun guy. We used to see each other a lot, go to soccer games, just chat. Now he's always busy, always in a hurry, and when we do get together, he's kind of tense. Those words got me thinking. It turns out that Chloe had not only changed not only her relationship with our family, but had also destroyed David's family ties. Does her need for control extend to her husband? Our conversation was interrupted by Chloe herself. She approached us with a strained smile, but I could see the irritation in her eyes. "Michael, how are you doing? I hope you're having a good time." "Yes, thank you. I've been talking to Victoria. She's a very pleasant woman." "That's wonderful, but I'm afraid I have to go pick up Grandma. The photographer wants to do some more shots with the bride's family." I knew it was another lie. The photographer had already finished half an hour ago and was packing up his equipment. Chloe just wanted to interrupt our interaction with Michael. "Chloe, the photographer, has already left," I said quietly. My granddaughter's face contorted with anger for a moment, but she quickly pulled herself together. "Then let's just go, Grandma. We need to talk." Michael sensed the tension and apologized, stepping back to the bar. Chloe took me under her arm and led me to the side, away from the other guests. Her fingers dug into my arm so hard it hurt. "Grandma, what are you doing?" she hissed, once we were in a relatively quiet corner of the hall. "What are you talking about?" "I was just talking to Michael." "You're gathering gossip about my relationship with David. I saw you whispering and looking at me." The accusation was so unfair that I was confused. "Chloe, we didn't say anything wrong. Michael just—" "Michael is a talker and a drinker. He's jealous of David and he's trying to break us up." "That's not true. He loves his brother and cares about him." "Don't you dare tell me what's true and what's not. You're a guest here and you're acting inappropriately." Chloe's voice was getting louder and louder, and I noticed some of the guests starting to turn around at us. I felt embarrassed by the scene, but I couldn't stay silent any longer. Chloe, stop it. You're making a scandal at your own wedding. I'm making a scene? You're the one who's been ruining my party all evening, prying into other people's conversations, giving unsolicited advice, trying to control the situation. I was trying to help. David's family feels rejected because of your behavior. My behavior? How dare you? Chloe grabbed a glass of red wine from a nearby table. I saw the rage in her eyes and realized something terrible was about to happen, but I didn't have time to react. My granddaughter splashed the wine in my face and on my dress. The cold liquid ran down my cheeks and soaked the fabric, leaving dark stains on the blue material. The smell of wine hit my nose, and there was dead silence in the room. All conversation had ceased. The music continued to play, but no one moved. The guests froze, unable to believe their eyes. The bride had just poured wine on her own grandmother in the middle of the wedding reception. You're ruining my party with your presence, Chloe shouted, her voice echoing throughout the room. You're always meddling in my business. Can't you just sit quietly and behave? I stood there, feeling the wine dripping from my chin to the floor, and felt dozens of shocked looks on my face. Thomas and Susan rushed toward me. David looked at his wife with horror. The Parker family was in shock. But something inside me had broken. Years of accumulated pain, humiliation, and coldness suddenly burst out. I wiped my face with a napkin, straightened my back, and made my way to where the microphone stood. Victoria, don't, Susan said quietly, trying to stop me. But I didn't listen. I reached the counter, took the microphone in my hands, and turned to face the frozen guests. Chloe looked at me with horror, realizing what was about to happen. Dear guests, I said into the microphone, and my voice echoed around the room. I can see that you are all shocked by what has happened, and I think it's time to tell everyone the truth about Chloe. Grandma, don't you dare, my granddaughter shouted, but I continued. The truth is that the girl I raised and loved disappeared years ago, and in her place came a man who thinks he can humiliate and use those who love him. The hall was quieter than the grave. Everyone listened without moving. David turned pale. His parents looked on in amazement. Chloe, you think no one sees who you really are, but I do see, and now everyone else will see it too. I stood with the microphone in my hands, feeling the drops of wine still dripping down my face, and looked out at the frozen crowd of guests. It was so quiet in the hall that only the hum of the air conditioner and distant sounds from the street could be heard. Chloe stood a few meters away from me. Her face was white with horror and rage. David looked at his wife, then at me, not realizing what was going on. You all think you know Chloe, I continued, my voice sounding calm and clear through the sound system. A beautiful, successful, educated girl, the perfect bride. But I'm going to tell you a story about who she really is. Granny, shut up right now, Chloe shouted, taking a step toward me, but Thomas intercepted her arm. Chloe, don't make it worse, my son said quietly. You've already done enough. I watched as the Parker family clustered together, watching the developments with concern and curiosity. Carol held her husband's hand. Her sisters filed forward to hear better. Michael stood next to the bar, his face expressing a mixture of shock and grim satisfaction. I'll start with the easiest one, I said. Chloe, do you remember when you told your parents in high school that you spent your prom money on a dress? The $200 Thomas and Susan had been saving for months, working overtime. Chloe's face contorted. That was a long time ago. What does it matter? And the truth is, you bought a cheap $50 dress and spent the rest of the money on drugs for a party at Brandon Clark's. Your parents still don't know about it. Susan awed and Thomas went pale. A whisper of surprise passed through the room. David looked at his wife with growing bewilderment. You're lying, Chloe shouted, but you could hear the panic in her voice. Or here's another, I continued, feeling a wave of long suppressed anger rising in me. When you were in college and you said you needed money for textbooks, your parents were denying themselves everything to support your education, and you spent that money on expensive cosmetics and going out to restaurants with your new friends who were richer. Enough! Chloe tried to break free from her father's arms, but he held her tightly. This is my wedding. You have no right. I have the right to tell the truth, I replied firmly, especially when that truth is about how you treat people. I turned to the guests, many of whom looked shocked. Chloe's co-workers interjected as if they were seeing her in a new light. David's friends frowned, not knowing how to react to what was happening. David, do you know how Chloe felt about her college roommate? To Marianne, that quiet girl from the farm family who went to school on a scholarship? David was silent, his eyes wide. Chloe made fun of her, mocked her clothes, her accent, her simple background, called her a redneck in front of other students, drove her to tears every day. And when Marianne finally couldn't stand it and transferred to another college, Chloe laughed and said she was finally rid of that loser. That's not true, Chloe shouted, but her voice shook. Marianne told her mother about it, and she called me, crying into the phone, asking what they'd done wrong, that their daughter had been so hurt by my granddaughter's cruelty. There was dead silence in the hall. I saw some of the guests interject with disapproval, especially Chloe's co-workers. They knew her as a confident but fair employee, and these revelations had clearly shocked them. And what did you say to me then, Chloe, when I asked you about it? That weak people shouldn't go to prestigious colleges, that it's survival of the fittest, that you don't have time to mess around with losers? Carol Parker pressed her hand to her mouth, her eyes filled with horror. Robert shook his head grimly, and Michael looked at his sister-in-law with outright disgust. Or here's another story, I continued, feeling the years of silence pouring into words, about the way you treated Miss Henderson, our elderly neighbor who was always kind to you. Chloe tried to interrupt me, but I spoke louder. Ms. Henderson baked cookies for you at Christmas, gave you birthday presents, and when she started having memory problems, you laughed at her, mocked her in front of her friends, called her an old wreck, and when she asked you to help carry bags from the store, you said you didn't have time for for charity. Mom, is that true? Thomas asked quietly, his voice sounding pained. Chloe didn't answer, only looked at me with hatred. And then, I continued, when Miss Henderson fell in the yard and broke her hip, you walked by, pretending not to notice, pretended to be on the phone. The poor woman was found by the mailman 2 hours later. David turned even paler. Chloe, tell me it's not true. But the granddaughter remained silent, pressing her lips into a thin line. And that's just the beginning, I said, turning to David. Do you know how she talks about your family when you're not around? How she calls your mother a stupid housewife? How she makes fun of your father and his primitive job? Robert Parker straightened, his face darkening with anger. She told me that your family was a temporary inconvenience, that when you get married, she'll find a way to minimize your contact with your parents, that people from your background only pull back those who aspire to succeed. Enough, David roared, raising his voice for the first time all evening. He turned to Chloe. Is that true? Is that really what you think of my parents? Chloe tried to pull herself together. David, darling, don't listen to her. She's old. She has memory problems. She's making things up. Answer the question, he barked. Did you say it or not? The silence dragged on. Chloe realized that denial was useless. Too many witnesses had seen her behavior during the evening. I may have said something like that, she finally admitted. But that doesn't mean I just wanted us to focus on our future. On our future? David interrupted her. Or on your ambitions. I watched Chloe's carefully constructed picture of the perfect wedding crumble. The guests were talking among themselves, many shaking their heads in disapproval. The atmosphere of celebration had finally evaporated. Now let's talk about something that few people know, I continued, feeling like I had to finish. About how you treat people at work. Several of Chloe's co-workers glanced over anxiously. Remember Anna, the intern who worked in your department last winter? Smart girl, diligent, but from a poor family. She really needed that job. Grandma, stop, Chloe said pleadingly. You did everything you could to get her fired, throwing impossible tasks at her, criticizing her for the slightest mistakes, spreading rumors about her incompetence. And when she finally left in tears, you told me over the phone that a spot had finally opened up for someone more suitable. One of Chloe's co-workers, a middle-aged man with glasses, nodded with grim understanding. I remember Anna. She was a good girl, always thought she was treated unfairly. And the recent story with Jennifer? I turned to him. The co-worker who claimed the promotion Chloe wanted? The man nodded again, his face darkening. Chloe found out that Jennifer was having family problems. Her mother was sick, needed money for treatment, and she used that information against her. Implied to her superiors that Jennifer was too distracted by personal problems, that she couldn't concentrate on work. Chloe got the promotion as a result. You told me then, I continued, looking directly at my granddaughter, that there's no room for sentimentality in business, that if people have problems, it's their business, not yours. Chloe's co-workers looked at her very differently now. I could see the disgust and disappointment in their eyes. The person they'd worked side by side with appeared capable of meanness and betrayal. And finally, I said, feeling my voice begin to shake with emotion, about how you feel about your own family. Thomas and Susan froze, realizing that something particularly painful was about to transpire. When your grandfather, Susan's father, was in the hospital before he died, he asked you to come. The dying old man wanted to say goodbye to the granddaughter he loved. Susan began to cry quietly. You said you had an important presentation at work, that you couldn't waste time being sentimental. Grandpa died without ever seeing you for the last time. Chloe, Thomas whispered with horror, and after the funeral, you asked Susan if grandfather had left a will, wondering if you'd gotten anything. When it turned out Grandma got everything, you said it wasn't fair, that the younger generation needed the money more. The hall was plunged into a sepulchral silence. Even the music had stopped playing. Someone had turned off the equipment. The only sounds were Susan's muffled sobs and the heavy breathing of the guests. Chloe stood in the middle of the hall, surrounded by stares full of judgment and disgust. Her carefully crafted image of a successful and charming woman had fallen to pieces. David looked at his wife as if he saw her for the first time in his life. That's who Chloe really is, I finished, setting the microphone aside. A person who uses everyone around her to accomplish her goals, who doesn't know what compassion, loyalty, or true love is, who thinks the whole world is obligated to serve her ambitions. I felt strangely relieved. The years of silence were over. The truth had been told. After I put the microphone away, there was such silence in the room that it felt as if time had stopped. I stood in the middle of the banquet hall, feeling dozens of stares, and suddenly realized the magnitude of what had just happened. A celebration that people had spent money, time, and emotion on had turned into a public execution. But I felt no regret, just a strange relief that I had finally told the truth. David was the first to break the silence. He slowly moved away from his wife as if she were an infected person, and his face expressed such pain and confusion that I felt sorry for the young man. Only an hour ago he had been a happy groom, rejoicing in the beginning of a new life. Now he was looking at Chloe with eyes full of horror and distrust. Chloe, he said quietly, and there was a plea in his voice. Tell me none of this is true. Tell me your grandmother made it all up. Chloe stood motionless, her face white as chalk, only her lips trembling. She opened her mouth as if trying to say something, but no words came out. Years of carefully constructed image had crumbled in a few minutes, and she didn't know how to get out of it. David, it's not like she's twisting everything, the bride finally muttered, but the words sounded unconvincing even to herself. What part is she twisting? David asked stiffly. The one where you bullied a girl in college, or the one where you called my mother a stupid housewife? Chloe tried to move closer to her husband, holding out her arms to him, but he backed away. David, please hear me out. Yes, I may have said some things wrong, but that was a long time ago. I've changed. People change. A long time ago? He interjected with a bitter chuckle. What about what you said about my parents last week? Was that a long time ago, too? Robert Parker stepped forward, his face blazing with anger. What right did you have to discuss our family? We accepted you as a daughter, and you went behind our backs calling us primitive. Carol Parker cried, holding a handkerchief to her eyes. Her sisters stood nearby, supporting her under her arms and casting contemptuous glances at Chloe. Michael crossed his arms over his chest and shook his head in disgust. Mom, Carol, I never meant to hurt you. Chloe tried to justify herself, but her voice shook and everyone could hear the falseness in those words. Don't call me Mom, Carol replied sharply, showing her temper for the first time all evening. After what we found out tonight, you're not my daughter. The Parker family rallied against the one who, until an hour ago, should have been their relative. I saw them glance around as if debating what to do next. Robert put his hand on his son's shoulder. David, maybe we should postpone all decisions until tomorrow. You're in shock right now, his father said quietly. No, Dad, David replied, not taking his eyes off his wife. Some things become clear at once, and what I've just heard, I can't live with it. Chloe's co-workers weren't silent either. The man in glasses, who had been nodding as I spoke, stepped closer. Chloe, now I understand what was going on in the office. Anna was a good employee, and I always wondered why she was fired. And the story with Jennifer, it all makes sense now. The other co-workers were looking over and talking quietly amongst themselves. I could hear scraps of their conversations. Always seemed too ambitious. Now I see how she got the promotion. We'll have to reconsider some decisions. Chloe realized that she was losing not only her husband, but also her reputation at work. Her face contorted with despair. That's not fair. You're judging me according to an old woman who hates me, she shouted, pointing her finger at me. I don't hate you, I said quietly. I hate what you've become. Thomas and Susan stood back, and I could see how worried they were. My son looked like he had aged 10 years in one evening. Susan was crying, but quietly, trying not to draw attention to her grief. Mom, Thomas turned to me. Maybe you shouldn't have been so public. Should I have? I interrupted him. Keep quiet for a few more years until Chloe ruined David's life the way she ruined the relationships in our family? Susan lifted her head and looked at her daughter with eyes wet with tears. Chloe, is that really how you feel about us? Are we really just a nuisance to you? Chloe didn't answer, but her silence was more eloquent than any words. A cousin, Patricia, who had come from California, came up to me and said quietly, Vicky, I always knew there was something wrong with Chloe. Even as a little girl, she was too calculating for her years. I nodded, remembering those moments, which at the time had seemed to me to be just manifestations of growing up. But now I realized that they were the first signs of who my granddaughter would become. The guests began to leave. No one wanted to stay for the celebration that had turned into a family drama. The waiters stood aside, not knowing whether to clear the tables or wait for instructions. The restaurant administrator looked confused and clearly regretted that she had agreed to host the event. Some of Chloe's friends tried to approach her, but she waved them away, as if she didn't want to see sympathy in their eyes. Her world was crumbling before her eyes, and she was alone amidst the wreckage of her ambitions. David took the wedding ring off his finger. They had been married at City Hall in the morning, and the evening was to be a celebration. He placed the ring on the nearest table. "I can't," he said simply. "I can't be married to a man I don't know, who I may never have known." "David, no," Chloe pleaded, grabbing his sleeve. "I will change. I'm going to be different. Please don't leave me." But he released himself gently from her arms. "Chloe, people don't change so drastically. What your grandmother told you, those aren't isolated mistakes. It's a pattern of behavior. It's who you are." The Parker family began to pack up for the exit. Carol was still crying. Robert was supporting his wife under his arm. Michael walked over to his brother. "David, let's go home. You'll sort out the formalities tomorrow." "Yes," the man nodded. "We'll need to file for an annulment." Hearing these words, Chloe collapsed into a chair and burst into tears. But these were not tears of remorse. They were tears of rage and disappointment that her plans had been ruined. One by one, the guests left the room. Colleagues left without saying goodbye to Chloe. David's friends followed his family. The relatives on my side began to disperse as well, casting final judgmental glances at my granddaughter. Patricia approached me before leaving. "Vicky, you did the right thing. Better the bitter truth than the sweet lie. That guy deserves to know who he married." I hugged my cousin, grateful for the support. Soon it was just us in the hall, me, Thomas, Susan, and Chloe. The waiters were clearing the tables, trying not to make any noise. The music hadn't been playing for a long time, and in the silence we could hear the clacking of the receptionist's heels on the marble floor. Chloe raised her head and looked at me with such hatred that I involuntarily recoiled. "You ruined my life," she hissed. "You ruined my wedding, my marriage, my reputation. I will never forgive you for that." "Chloe," Thomas said tiredly, "Mom didn't ruin your life. She just told the truth about what you yourself had been doing for years." "Shut up," shrieked the daughter. "You were always on her side, always chose her over me." "I chose the truth," replied the son. "And I realize now that Mom was right all those years ago when she said there was something wrong with you." Susan raised her head and spoke in a firm voice for the first time that evening. "Chloe, I've always defended you, always found excuses for your behavior, but after what I found out tonight, after the story with my father, I can't take it anymore." "Great!" Chloe shouted, jumping up from her chair. "So you're all against me. Lovely family." She grabbed her purse and headed for the exit, but turned around at the door. "I don't want anything more to do with you. None of you. You're dead to me." The door slammed and Chloe disappeared, leaving the three of us in the middle of the empty banquet hall. Thomas came over to me and hugged me. "Mom, I'm sorry. I should have seen it sooner." "We all should have," Susan added, wiping away tears. "But we wanted to love her so much that we turned a blind eye to the obvious." The restaurant manager timidly approached us. "Sorry to bother you, but we need to close the lounge. If you have personal belongings." I looked at the napkins scattered on the floor, the overturned glasses, the wilting flowers on the tables, the remnants of what should have been the happiest day of Chloe's life. "We have nothing," I said. "We can go." We slowly made our way toward the restaurant's exit. It was a cool November evening outside, and the fresh air seemed like an escape after the stifling atmosphere of the hall. Thomas stopped the cab. We drove home in silence, each of us absorbed in our own thoughts about what had happened and what would happen next. I knew that tonight had changed everything. Chloe had shown her true colors, and there was no turning back. But for the first time in years, I felt like I'd done the right thing. The truth, no matter how painful, is still better than a lie. The next day, I woke up in my bedroom, feeling like I had lived my whole life in one night. The sun was shining through the window. The birds were singing outside, but the house was unusually quiet. The phone was silent. No one called with the morning news or just to chat. I realized that the news of what had happened at the wedding had already spread among relatives and acquaintances. Around 11 in the morning, the doorbell rang. I opened it and saw Patricia and her husband Richard on the doorstep. The cousin looked excited, and her husband was holding a bag of groceries from the store. "Vicky, we decided to stop by before we flew home," Patricia said as she entered the hallway. "Wanted to make sure you were okay after yesterday." "I'm fine," I replied as I escorted them into the kitchen. "Would you like some coffee?" Richard set the bag on the table and pulled fresh scones and fruit from there. "Thought you might not feel like cooking today," he explained softly. We sat at the kitchen table drinking coffee and were silent for a while. Finally, Patricia spoke up. "Vicky, I've been thinking all night about what happened, and I want you to know you did the right thing." "A lot of people don't think so," I remarked. "Maybe, but I know what Chloe was like as a child. Even then, there was something about her that was cold. Remember when she was about 12 and came to visit us?" I nodded. It was one of the few times Chloe had agreed to spend the vacations with relatives other than me. She treated our dog Buddy like that back then. Didn't beat him, but was cruel in a different way, teasing him and then pretending it was a game. When I reprimanded her, she gave me this look, like she thought I was an idiot for defending an animal. Richard nodded. "I remember that too. And I also remember how she reacted when our neighbor, old Mrs. Cowan, fell in her garden. Chloe saw it from the window, but didn't even think to call us for help. Just carried on watching TV. At the time, we thought she just didn't realize the seriousness of the situation," Patricia added. "But now I realize she just didn't care." Around noon, Thomas and Susan came in. My son looked tired and my daughter-in-law looked like she had been crying all night. They said hello to Patricia and Richard, but it was obvious they had come to talk to me alone. "Mom, we need to talk about last night," Thomas said as the cousin and her husband left. We sat down in the living room. Susan was nervously rubbing her handkerchief while Thomas stared out the window, choosing his words. "Mom, I understand how you felt. I understand that you were hurt by Chloe's behavior. But what happened yesterday?" "What exactly?" I asked. "It was a public execution. You destroyed her in front of all those people." I felt a familiar irritation rising in me. What was I supposed to do? Continue to keep quiet while she destroyed David's life? You could have talked to her alone, or with David. Warn him privately, Susan suggested. "Susan, would you believe it if some older woman came to you and said these things about your fiancé? Or would you think it was just the gossip of an angry mother-in-law?" The daughter-in-law thought for a moment. "You're probably right. I wouldn't have believed it. Besides," I continued, "Chloe is a master manipulator. If I went to David alone, she'd portray it as an attempt to destroy their relationship. She'd say I had mental problems, that I was making up tall tales." Thomas sighed. "Perhaps. But now our whole family looks like dysfunctional people who make scandals in public. And what's more important, our reputation or the truth?" I asked sharply. He didn't answer, but I could see the conflict in his eyes. Part of him realized I was right, but another part of him was suffering from public embarrassment. Around 3 in the afternoon, the phone rang. It was Susan's aunt, Barbara, who lived in a neighboring town and couldn't make it to the wedding, calling. "Vicky, word has reached me about what happened yesterday," she said concernedly. "Is it true that that you publicly expressed grievances with Chloe?" "True," I answered briefly. "Oh my God, Vicky, do you realize what people are going to talk about? These are family matters. They don't take them out in public." "Barbara, what did you think I was supposed to do?" "Well, you could have worked it out within the family. Talk, find a compromise." I laughed, though there was no laughter in it. Compromise? With a man who thinks everyone around him is pawns in his own game? But Vicky, think about the consequences, about how this will affect Thomas and Susan, the whole family. After Barbara hung up, I realized that this conversation wouldn't be the last. Relatives would be calling, visiting, trying to convince me that I had done the wrong thing, that I should have kept quiet for the sake of family peace. That evening, my niece Jessica, my late sister's daughter, came over. She was 35, worked as a teacher, and had always been known for her common sense. Jessica hugged me and sat next to me on the couch. "Aunt Vicky, I heard about yesterday. Mom told me on the phone." "And what did you think?" I asked, preparing myself for another rebuke. "I think you finally did what you should have done a long time ago," my niece replied. "I remember how Chloe treated Mom before she died. When Mom was in the hospital, Chloe never once visited her. And then at the funeral, she asked if Mom had left any jewelry behind." I nodded, remembering that painful situation. "Aunt Vicky, a lot of people in our family saw what Chloe was really like, but everyone kept quiet because they didn't want to cause trouble, and you were the only one who had the courage to tell the truth." The next day began a flurry of calls and visits. Relatives, acquaintances, even neighbors. Everyone wanted to know the details and give their opinion. The first to arrive was Thomas's cousin, Rachel, and her husband, Paul. They lived in the same town and were considered a very respectable couple. He worked in a bank. She was an activist in the local women's club. "Victoria, we're here to discuss the situation at hand," Rachel began formally, as if she were conducting a business meeting. "What situation exactly?" I clarified. "What happened at the wedding, of course. Vicky, do you realize how much damage has been done to the reputation of the whole family?" Paul nodded in support of his wife. "Victoria, I understand that you had a grievance with Chloe, but there are civilized ways to resolve family conflicts." "Which are what exactly?" I asked. "Family counseling, for example, or mediation. You could see a family counselor." I looked at them and realized that they lived in a world where all problems were solved through proper procedures and polite conversation, a world where truly toxic people don't exist. "Rachel, Paul, do you know what Chloe did all those years ago? How she's treated people?" "We know she's ambitious and sometimes abrasive," Rachel admitted, "but that's no reason for a public scandal." "Sharp?" I interjected. "She gave a girl a nervous breakdown in college, framed her co-workers at work, refused to visit her dying grandfather." "That may be true," Paul interjected, "but public humiliation isn't a solution." "Is silence the solution?" I objected. "Letting her continue to ruin people's lives?" They left disgruntled, still not understanding my position. That evening, Uncle Frank, my late husband's brother, called. He was 82 years old and had always been a wise and fair man. "Vicky, baby, I heard about what happened," he said in his soft voice. "And I want to tell you one thing. Sometimes love requires cruelty." Those words touched me more than any previous conversation. "You see," Uncle Frank continued, "I've seen how Chloe has changed over the years. I've seen how she treats her parents, how she treats you, and I wondered if no one would say anything. Would everyone just pretend like nothing was going on? A lot of people think what I did was cruel, I admitted. You know what's cruel. Cruel would be to let her go on, to let her ruin this young man's life, to let her think she could hurt people with impunity. On the third day after the wedding, Thomas himself came to see me. He looked haggard and aged. "Mom, Chloe called," he said without preamble. "And what did she want?" "Demanded that you apologize publicly, that we organize a family meeting and work things out." I laughed. "Publicly apologize? For what? For telling the truth." "She says you misrepresented everything, that you misrepresented her. Thomas, you yourself have witnessed many of the incidents I've told you about. Do you remember the story of Susan's grandfather?" The son lowered his head. "I remember." "And the story about Miss Henderson?" "Her, too." "Then what exactly did I misrepresent?" Thomas was silent for a long moment, then said quietly, "Nothing. You misrepresented nothing. But Mother, she is my daughter after all." "And what does that mean?" "It means I can't give up on her, no matter how badly she behaves." I realized this was the root of the problem. The family had turned a blind eye to Chloe's behavior for so long precisely because she was their own, because rejecting a family member seemed unthinkable. "Thomas, loving someone doesn't mean indulging their vices. Sometimes love requires saying no." "Perhaps, but I'm not ready to completely sever my relationship with my daughter. No one is demanding that of you, but I'm not going to apologize for telling the truth either." After my son left, I sat in the living room for a long time, pondering everything that had happened. Calls and visits continued. Relatives tried to convince me to hush up the scandal, to find a compromise, to restore family peace. But I realized that there could be no compromise with a person like Chloe. She needs total submission, total acceptance of her rules. And I wasn't ready for that anymore. Late that night, Carol Parker called. "Victoria, I wanted to thank you," she said in a shaky voice. "For what, Carol?" "For saving my son. If it hadn't been for you, he might have spent years married to, with that man." Those words meant more to me than all the recriminations of my relatives. "David filed for an annulment," she continued, "said he realized he'd married an illusion, not a real person." After talking to Carol, I was finally convinced that I had done the right thing. Yes, I had destroyed the family peace. Yes, I had publicly embarrassed my granddaughter. But I also saved a good man from a life with a manipulator and a liar. The truth is painful, but lies are destructive, and I chose the pain of the truth over the comfort of a lie. 2 weeks had passed since that memorable evening, and life was beginning to take on a new shape. I sat at my bedroom window, watching the last leaves fall from the maple tree in the yard. November in Williamsburg was always a time of wilting and preparing for winter, but this year, fall seemed like a time of cleansing. The phone stopped ringing with calls from outraged relatives. Most of them had expressed their opinion of my action and no longer tried to change my mind. Some, like Uncle Frank and Jessica, kept in touch and even expressed approval. Others, like Rachel and Paul, had clearly decided that I had become an inconvenient relative who was best contacted as little as possible. Thomas came by every few days, but our conversations were strained. He was torn between his love for his mother and his love for his daughter, not knowing how to reconcile those feelings after what had happened. Susan visited more often and was more open in conversation. She admitted to feeling relieved that the truth had finally been told. "You know, Vicky," she said during one of the visits, "I felt guilty for years about not being able to connect with my daughter. Thought I was the bad mom, that I was the one doing something wrong. And now? Now I realize it wasn't about me. Some people can't be loved the way you want to be loved because they're incapable of reciprocating love." There were no calls, No letters, no attempts to contact Chloe. She disappeared from our lives as suddenly as the spirit of the child I had once known had disappeared from her life. According to rumors that came through mutual acquaintances, she took a leave of absence from work and went somewhere, perhaps to a friend's house in another state. David Parker, on the other hand, called several times to thank me. In the first conversation, which took place a week after the wedding, he said, "Mrs. Grayson, I want you to know, what you did took tremendous courage, and I'm grateful to you for it. David, I'm sorry it happened the way it did. Don't be sorry. It's better to know the truth now than years from now. I've already filed for an annulment. The lawyer says the procedure will take a few weeks." You could hear the pain in his voice, but not anger. Carol Parker came to see me twice. On the second visit, she brought a small gift, a knitted scarf she had made herself. "I want you to have something warm for the winter," she said as she handed me a neatly wrapped bundle. "And for you to remember, there are people who think you're a hero." A hero? I wondered. Yes, you saved my son from living with a man who would have ruined him. That's a feat. We sat in the kitchen, drinking tea, and Carol gave me the details of what had been going on in the Parker household since the wedding. David was in shock for the first few days. He tried to understand how he could have been so wrong about a person. But then he started remembering different moments in their relationship that had seemed insignificant to him before. What moments? Like how Chloe reacted when he told her about problems at work. She never showed any sympathy, only irritation that he was having difficulties. Or how she behaved when they went out with his old friends, constantly criticizing them after the meetings, finding faults in everyone. Carol also revealed that Michael, David's younger brother, admitted that he had long sensed something amiss in his brother's relationship with Chloe. He said David had changed since they started dating, became more withdrawn, laughed less often. Michael tried to talk to him about it, but David defended Chloe and refused to listen to criticism. "That's common," I observed. "People under the influence of manipulators often lose the ability to evaluate a situation objectively." David realizes that now, and he's very grateful to you for having the courage to tell the truth. After Carol left, I thought for a long time about how people get influenced by personalities like Chloe. David was an intelligent, educated man, but he too failed to see the true nature of his fiancée. Chloe was a master of creating illusions. She showed people exactly what they wanted to see. In the third week after the wedding, there was an incident that finally convinced me of the rightness of my choice. I was at the grocery store when I met Jennifer, the same co-worker of Chloe's who had not been promoted because of family problems. Jennifer recognized me and came over to talk to me. She looked better than the last time I'd seen her, less tired and stressed. "Mrs. Grayson, I heard about what happened at the wedding," she said quietly, "and I wanted to thank you." "For what?" "For finally having someone tell the truth about Chloe. You know, after that incident at the wedding, the management of the company started to reconsider some decisions. It turns out that Chloe was really spreading rumors about my incompetence. Jennifer revealed that after Chloe left on vacation, several coworkers decided to voice their complaints about her working methods. It turned out that many employees suffered from her toxic behavior, but kept quiet out of fear for their jobs. I was offered a promotion that I should have gotten originally," Jennifer continued, "and I know that only happened because you exposed Chloe's true colors. This meeting showed me that the repercussions of my behavior had spread much further than I had realized. People who had suffered from Chloe's behavior for years were finally given the opportunity to speak openly. In early December, I received a letter. It came without a return address, and I recognized Chloe's handwriting immediately. The letter was short and full of rage. "Victoria, you ruined my life because of your jealousy and anger. I will never forgive you for that. Don't try to mess with me. You are dead to me. I read the letter twice, then folded it up and put it in my desk drawer. No remorse, no attempt to understand my mistakes, just accusations and threats. That letter finally convinced me that Chloe was incapable of change. I wrote a reply that same day, even though I hadn't planned to send it. Chloe, I didn't ruin your life. I just showed people who you really are. If it ruined your life, then the problem isn't me, it's you. I loved you for years, but I can't love the man you chose to become anymore. I never sent the letter, but writing it brought relief. Christmas was approaching, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel anxious about family holidays. I didn't have to think about whether Chloe would come, how she would behave, who she would offend with her comments. I didn't have to walk on a knife blade, trying to keep the peace at all costs. Thomas and Susan had planned to spend Christmas at home, the three of them. They invited me, but I felt they needed time to adjust to the new reality without Chloe. Instead, I decided to spend the holidays with Jessica and her family. Aunt Vicky, my niece said during one of the phone calls, I'm proud of what you've done. My mother, your sister, would be proud too. Those words touched me more than any previous words. On Christmas Eve, I sat by the fireplace, reading a book and enjoying the silence. It was snowing outside the window, creating that special atmosphere of coziness that is only possible on winter evenings. The phone rang and I saw David Parker's number. Mrs. Grayson, Merry Christmas to you, he said. I wanted to let you know that the annulment of the marriage is finalized. I'm free again. How are you feeling? Much better. You know, strangely, I feel like I'm myself again. It's like waking up from a long sleep. We talked for a few more minutes and David revealed that he was starting to date a girl he knew before Chloe. I'll be more attentive to the warning signs this time, he joked. After talking to David, I walked over to the window and looked out at the snow-covered street. The neighbors had decorated their houses with garlands, and the soft lights created an atmosphere of celebration and hope. I thought about what had happened over the past month. Yes, I had shattered the illusion of family well-being. Yes, I have hurt many people, including myself, but I've also freed us all from having to live a lie. Chloe chose her path years ago when she decided that her needs were more important than other people's feelings. I just stopped pretending I didn't see that. Family bonds are sacred, but not when they become shackles that prevent you from telling the truth. Love does not mean unconditional acceptance of toxic behavior. Sometimes the greatest act of love is saying no. I walked over to my dresser and picked up a picture of 5-year-old Chloe with ice cream on her cheeks. That child had disappeared years ago, but I continued to love her memory. The adult Chloe was a completely different person, and I no longer had a relationship with that person. As I put the picture back up, I thought about the future. Maybe someday Chloe will realize her mistakes and change. Maybe she'll find the strength to sincerely apologize and work on herself. If that happens, I'll be ready to talk. But I will no longer wait for that change. I will not sacrifice my peace and dignity to maintain the illusion of family unity. Outside the window, the snow continued to fall, covering the world with a white blanket. Tomorrow will be a new day, a new year, a new chapter of life. And in this chapter, there will be a place only for honest relationships based on mutual respect and true love. I made my choice, and despite all the pain it brought, I had no regrets. The truth is painful, but it's freeing, and freedom is worth any pain.